everyone, my name is Miss Megan and I am the Children's Librarian at the Five Forks branch. And welcome to Quilting on the Page, the use of quilts and quilting in children's picture books. This video is intended to provide caregivers and educators with book recommendations revolving around a specific topic. All of the books that we discuss today will be picture books and can be found in the GCBL catalog for checkout. Before we get to the books, let's discuss what it takes to make a quilt. According to the Britannica Library, quilting is a sewing technique that involves making a sandwich of cloth and batting held together with stitches, and the quilt itself is most often thought of as a bed cover. Quilts can be rather simple and meant for the general purpose of keeping warm. However, quilts can also be more decorative and involve creating intricate patterns with different pieces of fabric. The style, color, sewing techniques, and materials used are completely dependent on the time the quilt is created and what the quilter has access to at the time. So how are quilts and quilting used as a theme and storytelling device in children's picture books? In this presentation, we'll explore 15 titles divided into 4 groups and discuss similarities these books share and how quilts and quilting plays into the stories as a whole. First, let's discuss the picture books that revolve around the stories and experiences of enslaved Black people in America. Today I'm sharing 5 books that focus on this topic, including Sweet Clara and the Freedom Quilt, Sewing Stories, Harriet Power's Journey from Slave to Artist, The Patchwork Path, A Quilt to Freedom, Showway, and Harriet Tubman and My Grandmother's Quilts. Sweet Clara and the Freedom Quilt follows a young enslaved girl named Clara as she is taken from her family and sold. She is taken under the wing of another enslaved woman, Rachel, who teaches her how to sew. Dreaming of running away to freedom, Clara begins working on a quilt to guide her, using the stories and details told to her by other enslaved people on the plantation. Sewing Stories, Harriet Power's Journey from Slave to Artist, tells the true story of Harriet Powers, born into slavery near Athens, Georgia, and taught how to sew at a young age by other enslaved women. It follows her through her life, using her sewing skills to provide for and build a new life for her family after the Civil War. 2 of her quilts now reside in museums in Washington, D.C. and Boston. The Patchwork Path, A Quilt Map to Freedom, focuses on the story of a little enslaved girl named Hannah and her journey with her father to escape to freedom. She brings with her a quilt created by her recently deceased mother, made with special patterns for Hannah and her father to use as a map during their escape. Showway is a Newbery Honor book, and the author Jacqueline Woodson tells the story of the women in her family, focusing on their relation to Suni, the first child born free. The book follows them through the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the Civil Rights Movement to the modern day, celebrating their resilience and achievements along the way. Harriet Tubman and My Grandmother's Quilts is a nonfiction title, and the author Lorenzo Pace tells the story of Harriet Tubman and her work on the Underground Railroad. He shares his connection to his grandmother, who told these stories to him as a child and created quilts for her family. He discusses how these quilts help him connect back not just to his mother and grandmother, but also to his ancestors and their struggles and triumphs in fighting for freedom. The book includes historical images overlaid on top of quilt designs. Within these stories, quilts and quilting are used to symbolize many things, including as a connection back to family, history, ancestors, and culture, as a way to pass down stories, information, and skills, and also as a symbol of the resilience, courage, and perseverance needed to face adversity. One final note before we move on. Many of these books use the phrase slave and master instead of enslaved and enslaver. Also, some titles, for instance, Sweet Clara and the Freedom Quilt, include some characters speaking in a dialect. Finally, many of these stories focus on the use of quilts as maps to the Underground Railroad. This is still a highly debated topic, with many historians stating that there is little to no evidence of a quilt code being used. However, quilts were often used to tell stories, and a good example of this is the case of Harriet Powers in the book Sewing Stories, Harriet Powers' Journey from Slave to Artist. And her story quilts, 2 of them actually, now reside in the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Our next category of books revolves around the stories and experiences of immigrants to the United States. For this section, I've included 2 titles, The Arabic Quilt and The Keeping Quilt. The Arabic Quilt follows a young girl named Kenzie, whose family has just moved from Egypt to America. When she forgets her lunch at home, her mother brings it to her at school wearing a hijab and speaking in Arabic. This leads to teasing by the other students. Kenzie finds comfort through writing poetry and the Arabic quilt her tita, or grandmother, gave her before leaving Cairo. With the help of a supportive teacher, Kenzie is able to share her culture with her classmates, making a quilt of their own and new friendships along the way. The Keeping Quilt tells the story of the author's family, starting with her great-grandmother Anna immigrating to America from Russia. As Anna begins growing out of her dress and babushka she's brought over with her, her mother adds it to the basket of other old clothes her family brought over with the intent to make a quilt to help them remember home. The story follows the women in the family as the quilt and stories are passed down generation after generation, all the way to the birth of the author's children. Within these stories, we see quilts used to explore familiar themes that we saw previously, including a connection back to home country, connection to ancestors, family, and culture, passing on traditions, as well as connecting and sharing the character's culture with others. Next, we'll discuss 3 books that use quilts to tell stories of community and family. These include the Patchwork Quilt, the Altogether Quilt, and Mushka, a Quilt Story. The Patchwork Quilt, which is a winner of the Coretta Scott King Award and a Reading Rainbow book, follows Tanya, whose grandmother sets out to make her very own quilt. Over the course of a year, her grandmother collects pieces of fabric from old clothes, stating, "A quilt won't forget." But when grandmother gets too sick to work on the quilt, Tanya and her mother go about continuing the project. The Altogether Quilt. A group of people of all ages and backgrounds come together to create a quilt. The children pair off with an adult in the group and work together to create an individual square reflecting their personality and taste. This book works through the entire process of creating a quilt, as well as providing information about the real community group that the book is based on. And finally, Mushka, a Quilt Story. Carla has a quilt she calls Mushka. It keeps her warm and protects her when she's scared at night. The quilt was made for her by her grandmother out of scraps, each with its own story to share. Carla learns about her family stories and continues the tradition by passing those stories on to her baby sister. As you can tell, we have similar things running through these books as well. So first of all, there's remembering and passing on family stories. There's also an emphasis on the comfort and joy of handmade items. There's coming together to create something great for everyone, as well as a slight discussion of sustainability, so using worn clothing and fabric to create something new. Finally, we're going to discuss how quilting is used in other books that don't revolve around a specific theme, but still involve quilts and quilting. First, there's The Quilt. It's a story of a little girl who tells the reader about her quilt that her mom and her dad made for her. She points out what all the pieces are made from and notices it looks like a town. She begins to dream of the adventures she would have, and each square bringing with it a different landscape. The Little Ghost Who Was a Quilt. A little ghost has a problem. Instead of being made of a light, breezy sheet, he's a quilt, heavy and a slow flyer. He wishes he was just made of one piece of fabric so he could fly and play with the other ghosts. On Halloween night, flopped over a porch railing to watch the fun, he goes on an adventure when a little girl and her mom find him and take him home. Peaceful Pieces. This book contains a collection of poems about peace, with the illustrations created through a variety of storytelling quilts. The poems range in topics from peaceful settings, calming an anxious mind, and being conscious of your words and actions, and more. The Quilt Maker's Gift. This is a fairy tale about a magical quilt maker living in the mountains who is known far and wide for her beautiful quilts. Though many come to buy her quilts, she refuses, saying her quilts are for those in need. When a greedy king hears of her quilts, he demands to have one of them to add to his collection of treasures, knowing this will finally make him happy. The quilt maker thinks and then tells him he may have a quilt if he gives away all of his other treasures. And finally, the Kindness Quilt. After learning about showing kindness to others, Minna and her classmates are asked by the teacher to do an act of kindness and then draw a picture of what they did. Minna has trouble deciding what kind of thing to do, as she's helping those around her. She ends up doing so many kind things that her one picture for the project won't be enough. She has to draw several pictures, turning it into a kindness quilt. This inspires the rest of her class to make kindness quilts of their own. These stories provide some new themes as well as some familiar ones. So, of course, there's the idea of connecting with stories and with others through the use of quilts. There's also the discussion of self-acceptance as well as kindness and generosity. Before we go, let's go over some overarching themes that we've discussed today. So first, there's the idea of using quilts to connect to family and culture and ancestors. There's also using quilts and quilting to share and pass down stories and traditions. There's also the idea of sustainability. Making quilts is a great way to use the materials you have to make something new. And lastly, there's providing a source of income for the family of the quilter. Thank you for joining me today. I hope that today's presentation gave you some new insights on how quilting is used in children's literature. And remember, all of these books are available through the Gwinnett County Public Library to read and share. So check out our catalog and request them today. Thank you, and goodbye.